All right, well, thanks for clicking play. Here we are. I'm Mike Hartmann, one of three co-editors of the Giving Review, with another co-editor of the Giving Review, Dan Schmidt, a mentor of mine from the Bradley Foundation, and somebody whom we have known for quite some time, Brent Haglund, on the order of decades, I guess I'll say. From 1988 to 2018, Brent Haglund was Chief Executive Officer of the Sand County Foundation, about which we'll speak. He also co-authored in 2005 a book called Hands-on Environmentalism with Tom Still. The Sand County Foundation is an environmental nonprofit that, this is my summary, Brent, not yours, so you can correct, that effectuates the thinking of Aldo Leopold. So why don't we start there, Brent? Who was Aldo Leopold?
Aldo Leopold was a landowner at the time he was inspired to write his influential book, Sand County Almanac. He was also the outstanding figure in wildlife management in the middle of the 20th century, a creative thinker. He was one of the first, reaching way back in time, one of the first graduates of the Yale School of Forestry in, I believe, 1909. He had an unparalleled record, shall we say, Mike and Dan, in the first half of the 20th century of innovation and leadership, scientifically, and above all, with respect to practical philosophy. The influence of Aldo Leopold is, believe it or not, in many people's view when it comes to understanding the limitation that any writing has. His book is selling more now than it did when 2 years after it appeared. It is it's one of the two most influential books in the environmental field, and the sales are going up. They're in the several millions of copies, and the other book that is reasonably close to being that influential is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. So there you have it, a thinker, a practitioner, and above all, a landowner, which gave him the impetus to write that great book.
And the book, A Sand County Almanac. Well, you know, I always wondered, Brent, I'm making you dumb this down maybe more than you thought you'd have to. Is there a Sand County? There's not. Is there? Well, why is it called that?
It's his use of a metaphor that comes out of what were called the sand counties of Wisconsin. Wisconsin had been glaciated. There was a vast area that was sandy because it had been a glacial lake, and it was bad farmland. It just was a place to go farm and go broke. And so it's a metaphor of bad country for farming that people with ingenuity, creativity, freedom, and ownership can bring back.
Fair for an ignorant liberal arts major like me to consider Aldo Leopold a conservative, the way we use that term now.
I would pick apart what I think there is inside of the richness of conservative. I would say respect and user of private property. Leopold was a practitioner of science that is measuring things. He knew that with great deliberation reached out to community, which I would call civil society. And above all, he was committed to individual, that is, one person responsible for improving the health of the environment. I'd say that that's a package deal. And the other thing that I would close with is he understood that for people to stay on the land, to keep their families there and the community strong, they needed to make money.
Yeah, all right. So is that the land ethic? Did you just describe the land ethic as he, I'll say, taught it?
I bring the land ethic into just two things. One is a commitment to do right by the land, which is meant to be the broad community, not just of land as real estate, but land as the community of people and what and whom they live with. So that individual responsibility is key. Two other things. use of science-based information, and the third is incentives, whether those are profit or an aesthetic incentive for people who are well enough off that they know where breakfast is coming from.
Yeah. So, now to the Sand County Foundation itself. When was it created, and how does it try to further the thinking of Leopold?
So the book, A Sand County Almanac, published in 1949, which was a year after Leopold's death, in the area where he died. And he died in a fire. He died in a fire trying to protect his neighbor's barn. That neighbor, he had a heart attack. That neighbor began to subdivide some of this land along the banks of the Wisconsin River, which was a horrendous decision aesthetically, and it really impinged on the integrity from a community standpoint of that place where Leopold had a shack, had family and friends, and brought the land back to better health without government intervention. And that was beginning to be developed. A man who was godchild of Aldo Leopold's wife, a man named Reed Coleman, a very strong conservative, an outstanding businessman and philanthropist in his own right, as well as being a member of a number of boards, including that of the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation. Reed, at age 31, created the Sand County Foundation to bring landowners together to create a legacy of commitment to the aesthetics and the integrity of the land and the farming and forestry that went on around Leopold's land. It succeeded. The first thing, thus, that Sand County Foundation did, Mike, was to bring landowners together.
For what purpose? As part of a project to do what?
The aim was to keep, if you will, the integrity of the functioning farms and forests around Leopold's property, so that they would not be subdivided. And subdivision of bad land, of bad for production sakes, comes with a lot of expense. And one of those expenses is delivery of disaster costs which to local government, the imposition of higher taxes when those lands are developed. Farmland becomes more expensive. But above all, it was a commitment that Reed sought for a group of landowners to come together, support each other, and help fulfill a vision that their neighbor Aldo Leopold had created.
Yeah. And then how about an example or two? Sorry, an example of project since then would be similar conceptually, but not in application. What would be other examples of Sand County's work?
Reed Coleman was an innovator, in some respects a pioneer, and he was steadfast. The principles that Sand County Foundation were written up as in 1967 are essentially the same. First and foremost, advance the land ethic. Second, to use science. Third, to develop incentives. And above all, seeing landowners as both means and ends.
May I ask you, Brent, I guess the question sort of bounces off your comment that the number of book sales of Aldo Leopold are going up, the land ethic and so forth. Are there any intersections you could point out between the current environmental movement in terms of just general, not specific, any general sort of agreement that Aldo Leopold would have based on his conceptualization of the land and its use and ownership and incentives, the things you just mentioned, and the current environmental movement? Again, it's broad and big, but just one or two things where they might intersect, and then whether there's any contrast or difference from, again, the large question, but sort of a few general points where he wouldn't intersect so easily with the conceptualization, the philosophy of the environmental movement today.
You frame up a a big and essential question. And I'll come at it with what I hope would be a partial answer, and that is where there is convergence of a land ethic as written out by Leopold with environmental improvement, and there's a growing body of evidence that this is happening. Dan, it's on private land. Most of the United States is private land. Most of that land is used for agriculture and forestry and ranching. Thus, the success of a land ethic can be measured by the number of landowners who are choosing on their own to come up with voluntary means to improve land health and hopefully make more money. That is growing. And let me give you one example of a group that's spawned and enhancing that effort. It's called Partners for Conservation, partnering together. And it's a way of bringing landowners together with government agencies. The leadership there is the landowners reaching out to government for support and for basically keeping government agencies, one would say, feet to the fire. They wouldn't put it that way, but to keep them in a mode of encouragement and support for landowners. There are other groups. One of the heartening things is to look at something like the National Audubon Society, which is embracing the, we'll call it the production of habitat for grassland birds. They know where that's got to come from. That's got to come from private landowners. The Nature Conservancy in some of its programs is specifically addressing environmental preservation and conservation through private landowner work. That's growing. I think that the opposite, if you will, is that which comes from concern about what others will call common pool resources. There's the business about Garrett Hardin's book on the tragedy of the commons, and that can be put down this way: that which you don't own, you can't manage. I'm making a quick and dirty statement about that. But the toughest places for what I would call conservative environmentalism to affect improvement of philosophy is on air and water.
Yeah. Why don't we finish up with part one there and talk about conservative environmentalism and air and water in part two next.